Well, it was, yes, an internment camp, but it wasn't a working internment camp. I was born way after the war was over, but my family, we were allowed to live there for several years until we got back on our feet. Because at the time of the internment, when the executive order came in 1942, all the Japanese Americans had to be uprooted from their homes. They could only take anything in 2 suitcases. So all their possessions were left behind, and basically their homes were taken away. Other people were waiting for them to move out, so other families moved in. And even after the war, my family, several other people went back to their homes, and they no longer existed. So everything was taken away except for the things they had in 2 suitcases, which they took with them. For me, because I was born in '54 and the war was over in '45, so we were the last family to live there, and the government allowed us to live there free of rent until we were able to find another place to live. And to me, yes, the house, now I look back at it, the house, they were like barracks. They were very thin-walled. You could see the sunlight through the walls. Wasn't very insulated. The floors were caving in. I remember, having to jump over the doorway because the floor was caving in. We had a wood stove. We didn't have a toilet in the house. We had to walk about 100 yards to a shower house. And then the toilets were basically outhouses. Yeah. And we did have running water, but there were so many mineral deposits in the water that I remember that we had a little cloth bag over the faucet, and it will fill up with minerals, and then hopefully filter out, so we would have water. I found it, because I was very young, very pleasant. It was fun. The playhouse, we each had a whole barrack for a playhouse. But now that I look back at it, yes, it was very poor conditions. As far as I know, fine. When they're interned, actually, there's another side of the story, because it was for their security. If they were not interned, a lot of them would have been ridiculed, and what they were, but they might have been shot on the street or whatever, and so is their security. So there's 2 sides of it. One was, yes, their citizenship taken away from them, and they didn't have any rights. But then again, if they weren't interned, there could have been, their life at stake because of the Americans and their attitude towards the Japanese. And a lot of them thought we were the enemy. My parents were the enemy, but they were Japanese Americans. They were born here, and they were true Americans. Yeah. And they had no connections or ties to the Japanese. But because we look like Japanese, well, we are Japanese, but we look like the enemy. They thought of us as the enemy. Okay, but in fact, we're Americans. Yeah. They felt they were Americans. They said this is how the Americans, how we do things here. This was the law, and so they went with the law. They went with the ruling. They knew, what else could they do? Right. They didn't quite understand, because they were Americans, and why were they treated like this? Yeah. Because they weren't the enemy. I'm sure they felt disgraced and such, but they didn't rebel or anything. They said, this is the American way, and we're here to be Americans, and we're going to follow the law. Beforehand, yes. After the internment, I think at first no, because they were all in the camps, and except for there's some exceptions. Most of them went to the major internment camps. My mother happened to have an opportunity to, and I don't know exactly how it happened, but she came to Malheur County from the Portland, Oregon area, and she lived as a housemaid in a home outside of Nessa. And the woman who lived there she was a burn victim. Her whole body was basically burned. And so my mother took care of her as a housemaid and nurse, cleaned her house, made her meals and such. Okay, so she was willing to do that. She had the opportunity to do that. My dad, instead of going into the main internment camps, he was in Washington and at the time, and then he was in the first group to come to Malheur County and be a farm worker, because at the time they needed farm workers, and they thought, well, let's use these Japanese Americans to come out here and let's test to see if they're able to do the work and we can trust them. So my dad actually came and worked here with a small group. He was in the first group and it worked out well, but at the time there was no place for them to live except they lived in tents. What they call Cow Hollow Park, and maybe some of you might be familiar with it because it is, they play baseball there, and it's a park, and people think, well, that's unusual. Why is there a park out there? But actually how it started, the barracks were built long ago when they were building Owyhee Dam, and all the workers who were working on the dam lived there. Okay, and then they were actually, when the dam was done, all the housing vacated, and it was called a civil corps camp, and so then they were vacant. So then the whole issue with the farm workers and such, and turning all these people who were working out the farms, they were placed there. So it wasn't a true internment camp. It was,
so just a place.
Right, right. But they did have guards. You know, when the first workers came out, they did have guards. I don't remember, but my sister, Mrs. Coda, who's at the high school, she remembers the guard tower. She remembers, and it was I think a medium security kind of camp. And eventually, they were trusted, and they could come and go as they could please. Yeah. And then, so yeah. Anyway. But I don't remember some of that. But if you go over to Cow Hollow Park, there's still some formations of bays of where the column stood, where it stated the Cow Hollow Park or Civil Corps Camp. And anyway, but I don't recall much of that. Well, it was actually called a labor camp, okay? And so I was like 6.5 when I moved out. So basically we had a huge park area in the center, and I played. I basically played and I had fun, and I didn't know any better. The family life was very good, and but in terms of, I had this whole freedom on running around and playing, and I had a good time, and I don't have any bad memories of it at all, which is good. Yeah. And I didn't realize that at the time that it was a labor camp, and it was my home, and went to school, rode the school bus, went to school in Nessa, and lived like anyone else. And it wasn't until years later that I realized the conditions, how poor they were. So, but my family never told me differently or made me feel any different. Yes and no. My parents were, because some went to the major internment camps, and then some decided, like my father, to be a laborer, and my mother separated from her family to become a house nurse. So they were, and from that I was, because those family members who were once together, like in Portland or Washington, went to different areas. And after the war was over, they relocated to different areas where their work was. So some went down to California, some went back to the Portland area. So yes, in that sense, yeah, I probably was, but I didn't know any different.